Thank you.
Thanks, Lily. So thank you for all coming back. I imagine there are a lot of familiar faces from yesterday's federal panel, but we wanted to look at foreign influence two different directions. And today's panel is the university perspective on the management of improper foreign influence. And we're extremely grateful to have a very strong panel that includes both faculty and administrators. Next slide. I think what the primary focus today is we haven't done it enough or as much as we wanted to get the faculty perspective on how this is impacting daily lives and what the concerns and worries are for how we manage appropriately foreign influence without it having too great a cost on the effective conduct of science. So as I've said, we've pulled together this faculty panel, but also we're having an opportunity to also look administratively at how this is impacting us at the campus level as well. We're going to talk just a tiny bit as well, next slide, about what the Foreign Influence Working Group is doing in this space at the moment. So because we were lucky enough to have yesterday's federal panel, we also had a group discussion earlier today and have a few reactions that we want to share with all of you. And we would invite you by using the Q&A function to also share your perspectives about yesterday's federal panel on improper foreign influence. And then we're going to do a faculty panel, and we picked several key topics to talk about there. And we'll finish with the administrator perspective today. And of course, the ever popular Q&A. Next slide. So we have our panelists today, our names and faces, I think, that are all known to FDP very well. And you can see them here. So, but before we get started with that, next slide. Jim, do you want to talk just a little bit about our Connecting the Dots efforts?
Sure, very briefly, because I would imagine most heard this yesterday, and if not yesterday, we talked about this in January. But this is kind of right at the sweet spot of, as administrators, we look at this and we look at this as kind of a science problem about how we're going to connect these dots and figure out the tools and figure out the processes. But when we talk to the faculty about it, there's much more practical day-to-day things that they bring up, and that's what we'll talk about today. And the only other thing I'll say about this slide is when we discussed this in January, we also had summaries of 7 white papers. There were 2 white papers that had faculty pieces to them. One, we kind of euphemistically called it pitting the institution against individual faculty. In other words, how difficult it is, whether you get a letter or whether faculty, how they approach you on these issues. It sometimes is a little bit contentious, and that'll be a topic about the faculty perspective. And then the 6th white paper was just entitled Faculty Perspective, and that's what we'll talk about today. Next slide. As you heard yesterday, we did a thought exchange. We asked explicitly, what are the most pressing concerns that you have in this space? Next slide. And again, for those of you that didn't join us yesterday, it was recorded, and I did go into this in much greater detail. But this is the word cloud that's automatically created by the thought exchange. I think we had about 150 people that responded. There were common themes, as you can imagine, about harmonization, about definitions, and so forth. That'll come up a lot as an overriding theme today. Like, practically speaking, when a faculty member is making a decision on an individual appointment or affiliation, and should it or should it not be included, those are the types of things that we're talking about today. Next slide. Pamela?
I think you all know that we're members of the Foreign Influence Working Group for FDP. And I wanted to show you one thing that happens when you leave FIG alone in a dark Zoom room. Basically, we go off and start brainstorming ideas. And as we've been trying to figure out what do we do about some of the challenges that we're going to talk about today, and we talked about yesterday, we have just started brainstorming some possibilities about a key investigator clearinghouse. We've had pretty good luck with clearinghouses at the FDP. And so we just wanted to share you that we're thinking about this. We welcome any ideas or input that you'd like to share with Jim and me, and we'll make sure it gets to the full group. But we're thinking about a possibility of having some kind of a common data set that would be accessible to all of us, to agencies, investigators, and institutions, with the idea that an investigator or his or her delegate maintains their personal data, appointment data, for example, or other support data, possibly in some kind of a database. And then they authorize access to their institution or to an agency as a condition of applying for or receiving funding from that. But then also that this data could be entered in one place and shared many times based on when it's actually needed. There's lots of potential benefits to this, and there's also lots of potential challenges with something like this. And our discussions are just in a very early brainstorming stage. But again, if you're interested in that, we would invite you to share any ideas that you have about such a concept with us as we continue to discuss that topic. Next slide.
So on this slide, this is a very, very high-level summary of what came through at the panel. On a very positive front, it's clear that they understand the importance of harmonization, and Michelle and Jean are co-chairs of a work group that's focused on this. The second topic here is kind of this lens by which we look at these things, and if there is an activity, an affiliation, appointment, or something else that has the potential to influence research, the integrity of the research, or create overlap, it's probably reportable. If it doesn't create that potential for the integrity or improper influence, and it does not have the potential to create an overlap, then it probably doesn't need to be reported. That's kind of a high-level summary, and there'll be lots more discussion about that bullet. Bullet 3, Jean shared that there is a table that they're creating. Again, everything from NSF is largely waiting OMB approval, so we don't know if that'll be a day, a week, or a month, but it'll be sometime in the near future. Michelle talked about on Monday, but also yesterday, that many elements of the notice has shifted from May of 2021 to January of 22. Lots more on that. Bindu talked about how DoD has created a risk framework, and that's how they will identify potential concerns and issues that they have. The other thing that she noted is that DoD will provide principles that the individual Air Force, Navy, and so forth will have a little bit more latitude to implement that, but the guidance and the principles will come from above. And that lastly, we as universities, as you're going to hear today, continue to have lots of questions about definitions. What do we really mean by consulting? What is the definition of research, outside activities, lots of the themes that we're going to talk about today. Next slide.
So with that, we're going to go ahead and launch right into our faculty panel. And as in preparation for this session, we asked a number, our panelists and others, kind of what were kind of the biggest issues and that we're most interested in. So you see that those listed there on the screen, and these were areas, and again, that came out of these white papers as well. And then things that have evolved since then. And so what we'll do is we're going to take each one of those topics a little bit in turn and have one or all of the faculty panelists weigh in on those. And again, we encourage you to also put Q&A or comments in Q&A as well. We're happy to take those there. They've created a kind of a fun way to do this. So we're going to do a little bit of polling as well to understand exactly what's most important to everyone that's involved in this discussion. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura.
Well, let's see, I'm speaking. Okay, so thank you for having us here. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is collaborations and authorships. And before I get to that, we wanted to do a poll and see what the audience feels about this topic. Are you familiar with it or not? So could we put up the poll? So we want to know, is this an issue for you? Is it somewhat of an issue, significant issue, critical issue, or your most important issue that you're dealing with in trying to manage through this foreign influence? So go ahead and vote. And Lillian, you'll stop the poll when it's ready.
Yep, we're only at 52%. So let's get a few more in. If everyone could just enter your thoughts into the poll, that'd be great.
And we're putting a poll up for each of these topics so we can kind of get your view on each one. We're probably good. Okay, so it's definitely somewhat of an issue. We have 48% saying that collaborations, including authorship, are an issue. 36% saying a significant issue. Only 1% said a most important issue. So that's interesting, but really comes into, it is an issue. With only 7% of the whole poll saying not an issue. Okay, so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about this, and I'll start with 3 points on this topic. We were sort of thinking about what are some of the issues that we've faced, and one of those is what do we do with these non-domestic collaborations, and what do they mean? And we thought we heard in yesterday that maybe those collaborations have some paper agreement or contract, and that's what we would report. And if that was the case, we've seen that there's some people who mentor, put our mentors on student committees, foreign student committees, because they want foreign mentors. And we sign those contracts. We have annual meetings and they're signed. They would fall under this. They're part of our research. They're, and so we think, well, so following those rules, is this something that should be declared because it's a written agreement in our research area and expertise? I mean, there are other things that have come up too about collaborations as far as the sharing data, which I think would go under support, but there's still some, we still question these things as we look at them. Purchasing products from another company, is that's probably a support, or is that, do we collaborate? How far is that relationship? If we pay for it, is it not a collaboration? The second point I wanted to bring up is the aspect of authorship. And what do we do with this? I'm still confused by it. In my 35 years of research, I've had hundreds of side projects, the most of which never got published. And so they're not, if publication is a criteria for the collaboration and its declaration, then all right, then that's good. Okay, I can go with that. But once it's published, it's it's after the collaboration is done, and then I don't need to declare it. So I'm not sure how that works, how we decide whether, if authorship, then if I'm not sure that it's a publication and then suddenly it gets published, am I in trouble because of this? Those are some of the things as faculty that we're thinking of. What if I'm on a paper and the co-author, the main person writing the paper is in another state and I'm involved in a figure of that paper and someone in a foreign country is involved in another figure, but I'm not really interacting with that person. I don't even know that they're part of the group until it gets close to publication because I'm not the head of this. And so is that, is that an area where I have to worry about all the things that are going on in all the collaborations that I'm in? And then my third point on this is, what do I do with this information? So, I know I've got to do something with it and report it. And I originally thought this was going to be part of the new Biosketch. And then it turns out I had to do a couple Biosketches this past month, and I couldn't figure out where is this new Biosketch and realized that I used the old Biosketch. And then yesterday I was enlightened to find out that the new Biosketch is really the old Biosketch, which is the 2/28/2023, just without section D, and requires more input on my positions. But I didn't know that. And so it would be helpful if some of those things were posted on the website and easier to find, because I was panicking because I had to get this Biosketch done and I was looking for that information. And those two things of why it's new would have been really helpful, what the differences are, or putting within the Biosketch itself the things that should go in the different areas. And I open it up to my colleagues to add on to this. Alice or Michelle?
Well, I have a question just as a administrator. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Alice.
No, go ahead.
Please. Well, my question was more about, like, practically, as I'm an administrator supporting you, right? You're coming to me and you say, I don't understand these regs, right? And this is a collaboration. And I say, well, NIH encourages collaborations. You don't need to worry about that, right? Because that was said yesterday. But then you go down this deeper discussion of, it could end up as a paper, but it might not end up as authorship or a paper for 2 months or 2 years. And all of these issues are the things that all of a sudden we as administrators and you as faculty will have to determine, could it potentially be something that has to be in your other support because it's a research endeavor, because it's not an informal collaboration, but there's some level of formality, and or is it just a Biosketch? So I just wanted to kind of state that from an administrator's standpoint, that I wouldn't know how to answer that question.
And, some of these collaborations, they start and then they stop because I have to switch my gears. I've gotten funded and I've got to focus on a project. Then things open up again. I have some time, then I go back to it. So it can be more than 2 years. It can be much longer where I go back and I'm picking things up. And the same thing happens with papers, even from students in the lab. The less prioritized ones are going to be done later. And I don't know how to manage reporting all the different projects, if that's going to be required, that are going on in my mind and in the lab.
I can give a specific example that I was going to mention later that a colleague called me about last week. This is a colleague who has funding from either NIH or NSF or USDA. I don't remember which, and it may be 2 of the above. But this colleague has had a long-term postdoc in the lab who has left the lab to take a faculty position. And now they're working on a paper that the former postdoc is in the 1st or 2nd year of a faculty position, and so wants to list the new institution in the as the source of the paper, as their affiliation. Well, the new institution is a university in China. And this project doesn't have any foreign component on it. And no, there's been no discussion of potential other support of that postdoc. I mean, this was somebody who did experimental work in the States and is now moved to China. And the faculty member is also ethnically Chinese and is concerned that this is going to raise a problem with the funding agency, because a normal part of science in which someone leaves a lab, takes a position someplace else, publishes from that position, now they're concerned that, is this going to be when the postdoc took the position, did that create a foreign component? Because they continued working on this paper from the lab, is it going to raise questions? And I've thought of this initially as it's almost persecution of somebody based on their ethnic identification or the fact that they are a foreign scholar. So I think, Jim, that's an example of ongoing collaboration created as part of our training relationship that we are not sure how we're supposed to report. And the reason the person called was because a colleague of ours has gotten, who has, in this case, I know it's NIH funding, has had their agency staff, their institute staff, reach out and say, you've published this review paper that lists a grant that at another institution. You didn't report that as part of your other support. You didn't report that as a foreign component. And this was a research paper, this was a review paper that involved faculty from multiple countries. And one of the concerns was that apparently the agency asked about the funding that seemed to have been from an institute in China to a Chinese co-author, and didn't ask about the funding that came from a Korean funding source to a co-author at a university in Korea. So that again triggered concerns about why was the question only about funding from an institute in China, but were there any reporting requirements triggered by the fact that you're collaborating with somebody who has funding from another institution, from another country? And that's a collaboration question, I think.
I know we're going to have to move on here in a second, but Michelle, did you have anything to add to that?
Thank you. And I am also noticing there are quite a few comments in the chat that are popping up, and I promise we will have ample time to go back and answer some of those. On the collaboration piece, I can use my own example of having been a Fulbright and run a USIA University Affiliations program in Brazil for 5 years. It's the kind of program that is it a foreign component or is it a funded US grant? I think that's the fundamental, beginning point of the question, because it would be listed on your grant support. It's very clear that what you've been funded to do would be to build an international collaboration. And there are quite a few federal programs that support that kind of activity. It also my particular program aimed to create a network of organizations in Brazil, including a number of institutions. I didn't have affiliations with any of those institutions other than the initial Fulbright that I had. But it's one of those things where you think you're reporting it in the right place on your CV as a grant, or alternatively, if there's any support for your current research, which in that case there wouldn't be, but immediately you go to that complexity of, well, I'm not really sure how I'm supposed to handle this, nor more importantly, where I go for guidance that would help me clarify the answer to that question. And I think that's the kind of example that I think comes to mind for an awful lot of investigators as they seek to do the right thing. So clearly one can always simply report everything, throw in the kitchen sink, so to speak. But I think one of the points that Laura has been making about this, and I don't want to take your comment away, has to do with the limitations of what you can include, in your NIH Biosketch, for instance, and how much space you have to do that. And so you start to get pretty judicious about what you can and can't include, and hope that you've got it covered in one place, but in fact, you might have had to have included it someplace else. And I think all of that leads to tremendous angst on the part of the faculty that I work with, the vast majority of whom want to get it right, but don't really know how to interpret the rules. And we'll talk a little bit more about how those can be, how those can vary by agency, further complicating this issue.
And I just want to echo that 5 pages and having to put in all of these new things, it makes it very difficult. I'm at 5 pages, and I can't cut the science parts. And so, then it makes it difficult to make the selections of what I'm appointed for. That's all I wanted to add.
No, that's great. Well, I know we heard originally in the white papers, and I know as administrators, we've had a bunch of questions too on what to include in other support relative to consulting and outside activities. And I think, Alice, you wanted to talk about that a bit, as I recall.
Thank you, Pamela. I'm hearing from colleagues a lot of confusion still about what NIH and NSF, but NIH in particular, because I think this is in the FAQs, what they mean by a consulting agreement that includes conducting research. Does that, if you're doing a consulting that you're providing instruction about an area in which you do research, is that considered conducting research? Is the fact that you're consulting with a colleague on a research project? Yes, that. But if you're consulting on a particular set of methods that might be being used for teaching, might be being used for research, and you're not going to be necessarily an author on the papers that are coming from this, does that need to be reported? So I think it would be helpful to have some explicit examples of what the agencies, what NIH is describing as non-research consulting activities as compared to a consulting activity in which a key personnel is conducting research. I think there's still some confusion about that. And I think there's also confusion about why the requirement for supporting documentation, the copies of contracts, copies of appointment letters and things, is only applying to a foreign contract or an appointment at a foreign institution. It certainly seems possible that contracts from a domestic ne'er-do-well corporation or organization might contain either non-disclosure requirements or collection goals with respect to intellectual property. And so I think colleagues who are engaged actively in consulting don't understand why it's only your foreign associations where you have to produce that contract. And my general counsel doesn't seem to understand that either.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Laura?
Yeah, I think that, along this lines, the idea of what do you do with editorial ships? So it seems to be, it's really confusing because if you're an editor and it's a European-based journal, do you report that? Where does that go? If you get some money, is that, it's probably not other support, I guess, but it seems like it's something to list. But then we've seen faculty that are concerned even because now, what if you're an editor on a company, a journal that's based in the US, but you have foreign reviewers or foreign articles coming in? Is that a conflict? So, it's interesting how the details start coming up and people just aren't sure what to do and they're concerned.
Yeah.
So Laura,
So I
could
know-
I ask you and Alice a question? I mean, one of the statements that we discussed yesterday that resonated with Michelle is, again, if you're doing an activity that does not have the potential to impact the integrity of your research, and I would think an editorialship does not, right? You're right, it does not, there's nothing that could unduly influence you one way or the other, I think, but comment on that. And the second, is there any potential overlap of science, budget, or time? And if none of those four are the cases, then generally speaking, that item is not research. Does that fit in for the example you just gave, for example?
So one wouldn't. The first point, you're right. It's, what was the first point? Is
integrity of research and integrity of research. Is it undue influence, improper influence?
Research. The second one is but it would take time. And especially
Sure.
at a higher level, being an editor can take time. But is that, are you going to, is that my time as a researcher? Is that my spare time?
But that's a good time. The way I would have answered it if you came to me, I would have said, well, Laura, if you're doing that in your 1 day a week consulting and you stay within your 1 day a week consulting, then it's not an issue, right? It's not impacting your appointment period, right? If it's significantly more than that, it's a more complex discussion.
So
does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So then we would say probably to all people that they don't have to report that, although they might, because it's an honor to be an editor. So it might go in positions which will take up a line, but that one, is probably not needed for foreign influence.
Jim, I think it would be very helpful to have that level of detail that they talked about yesterday spelled out in the FAQs.
Yep.
Because I felt that her comments answered many of the questions that colleagues have raised, but that's not what the FAQ said when I looked this morning.
Okay, good.
When we're talking about consulting, one thing too that we've been struggling with is it related to your research, or when you do consulting, do you do consulting to aid the research of a third party? Like a company's research. Do you think that from your perspective, is that distinction useful? Or is it so blended that really doesn't help us get anywhere?
I think it's very blended.
Okay.
I don't think I could parse that.
You could parse that, okay.
Yeah.
I think it depends on what the goal is. So if you don't want me to release secrets of my knowledge, consulting is releasing my expertise. I don't know what the goal for doing that would be, or including that aspect, I guess. I think so. Rationale for some of these things would be helpful in assessing if they need to be disclosed, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's going back to that concept of, is there overlap with your research endeavors? And so I think, we're trying to just puzzle through, is there any way we could crisply articulate or distinguish between some kinds of consulting activities and other kinds of consulting activities? And would one parameter potentially be you're doing it for your own research, or you're doing it for somebody else's research? You're helping them with their research. But I'm hearing, Alice, you say that, you know, that's just not very clean and crisp to go at it that way. So, which is why I'm asking you, because right, you guys, you live it.
I think it would be difficult. And I think part of the problem is that some of the bad actors have used the term consulting or honorary appointment when the position has been something very different.
Okay.
I would just add one small comment, which is that sometimes consulting is the mechanism that an institution uses to onboard a participant from a university in lieu of issuing a subcontract. So I think that's another confusing component to consulting. And that's why it's hard to determine, I think, as a faculty, whether my consulting activity that I was involved in fact, is research, because a lot of people will take their consulting activity and the products from consulting and report it on their CV, especially if there are publications involved. And so they're not really thinking about, they're not connecting between the two. I received money as a consultant, maybe just an honorarium, but using the language of consultant to be able to be involved in an evaluation project for a grant that a colleague of mine did. And then I get a publication out of it, which is clearly a work product that I consider to be scholarly. I might even get merit for that. But the consulting might not have had anything to do with my university appointment. And I just think that's why it gets very murky very quickly.
Okay.
I suppose, you know, people will err on the side of reporting more rather than less, but I think that becomes an issue for people in trying to discern what to tell.
Well, I'm wondering if it might be valuable just for insight for the FIG group, if nothing else, to use the poll question for this to understand how much time and effort should FIG be spending on this particular topic, and how significant a concern it is. So Lily or would you mind pulling up the polling question for this, and maybe the audience can help us?
Yeah, could you re-elaborate on which topic it is?
Oh, sure. It's the outside activities and consulting. The second one.
Yep, there you go. Thank you.
Thank you. So if everybody could weigh in here and let us know if this is an issue for you, how big an issue it is for you. That would be really appreciated. Is it not an issue, somewhat of an issue, significant, critical, or is it the thing we should be spending all our time on?
You know, one thing I wonder on this is the polls being done. Probably most institutions on this call have to make a determination about somebody is a contractor or an employee. And we at Duke have 12 questions. You know, do you work independently? Do you set your own hours, that kind of stuff. And then we make the determination, are you an employee or a contractor based on the preponderance of your answers, right? Mm-hmm. And if you answer more no, then you're a contractor. If you answer more one way, then you're an employee, and that's how we treat you. I wonder if we need to come up with a bunch of characteristics of consulting. And so authorship is an indicator. And there's some that are like go, no go. If you say it has the ability to impact your, improperly influence your research, then game over. You don't need to go any further, right? That's reportable. But something to think about at some point.
I've wondered if is some of the concern about reporting consulting a concern that I might be disclosing my grant secrets there aren't any, to someone, to a outside company before I let NIH know about it. And that, so is it that I could be inadvertently or purposively disclosing intellectual property, NIH's intellectual property?
Yeah. Interesting.
But that by definition has the potential for scientific overlap, right? Right. So
Yes.
it's reportable, right? Yeah, I think that's a fair question. But if you're asking that question, the answer is yep, it's reportable.
Yeah. Could they make use of NIH's intellectual property? Maybe that's
Right.
Yeah. So clearly that's interesting that this is a major issue. Clearly with 65% saying it's either critical or significant, and more than 90%, basically saying it's up there for them. And so that's very helpful, that's a topic area that we'll want to dig in further. Thanks everybody for responding to that. So, so it looks like 40% of you said it's significant, 25% said it was critical, and 28% said somewhat, and 4% thought it was the most important issue. And I'm just reading those out loud as well, because we'll want to record those for posterity, and the recording doesn't share us the poll results. So this way we'll have those. Okay. Michelle, do you want to go on and talk about appointment terms? I know that was a topic that the faculty were very interested in.
I do. Thank you very much, Pamela. I want to give a little context for this conversation as well. So many of us involved in the Foreign Influence Working Group have been in conversation on this connecting the dots issue with our federal partners for some time. And one of the issues that kind of came up in some of the conversations with our partners at different junctures was what we felt was perhaps a lack of appreciation that not all faculty were employed and paid for 12 months period of time. And so there's this sort of expectation that we ran into in engaging with our federal partners about that just sort of fundamental understanding, and needing to clarify that and needing to figure out how that factors into what the requirements are in terms of disclosure. On some campuses and in some departments, the appointments can vary from being a 12-month employment term in which an individual receives all of their funding to do work for the institution. And so it's pretty clear cut in a 12-month appointment that the activities that you're involved in over the course of 12 months connect with your primary employer and with your role in that institution. For those who are 9-month appointees, and many faculty on many campuses are both appointed for 9 months and compensated for 9 months, there is this sort of gray zone about, well, where is your affiliation for the other 3 months? To complicate that further, some institutions annualize benefits to cover 12 months, but in fact, it's really taking the 9-month allocation and simply stretching it out over 12 months, not really fully compensating for the 12. And to add complexity to that issue, as we all know, many PIs are contingent faculty, so they don't have full-time appointments at any one institution, 9-month or 12-month. They may have multiple appointments at multiple institutions and count many institutions as home, which can lead to a really complicating issue if you're reporting through one of those institutional affiliations when you're submitting a grant there. And so I think all of that variability in appointment comes into play when one is trying to factor in, what part of my professional experience and life, belongs in a disclosure to a given federal agency that I'm applying to funding for, and what part is really outside of the purview of that because it's neither being compensated by, my institutional home, nor really part of what I even report to that institution. And I think particularly in 9-month appointments and in contingent appointments, many faculty, because they're not being compensated, don't really have a report, don't have a reporting requirement to their home institution, which means that institutions, wearing my research administration hat, institutions which are responsible for verifying the data around a particular employment have that tricky issue of, well, are we accountable for the 3 months, or alternatively for the time, the part of the contingent faculty members' time that isn't being covered by our institution? How are we in fact responsible and obligated to account for that and make sure that we have that documentation? So I just think that issue is something that we discovered actually in our conversations with our federal partners was a lot more ambiguous than I think they had initially intended. And just to share further insight, I think some agencies had a different feeling about that than others, but a lot of the thought was, well, but if you're paying them and their appointment and their identity is connected to your institution, then doesn't that mean they're connected to you? It's like, well, except for the part where they're not actually getting compensated for the part of the time that isn't covered in their appointment, in which case, we have some real ambiguity there, I think, on the part of what faculty think they're supposed to do. We do have a poll on this issue if people would like to take it. Do you agree that that's an issue? I'd be very curious to see what people think about this issue. So the poll, yes, go ahead and post the poll. 9-month appointment terms generally. So basically this whole concept, is it an issue? Is it not an issue, somewhat of an issue, a significant issue, a critical issue, or our most important issue? Please do share.
And I think this one's particularly tough, right, Michelle? Because if you're a 9-month faculty member that does a lot of outside, or has a lot of outside engagement, it may be of greater concern for you than a 12-month. So, and we know we have both. So we know we have both.
We know summer is a time when faculty do a lot of research and travel as a means of being able to do that. In some cases, people are able to fill in their bucket of funding, their summer time with grant funding, in which case it's pretty clear cut what to report. But in other cases, faculty aren't getting support for that particular activity. And so it becomes, I think, a question of whether or not that's something that has to be disclosed. I don't know if Alice has additional comments on this.
I think there's certainly confusion about whether or not those appointments that you would have in your off months, those 3 months, do those appointments have to be reported on your NIH Biosketch? Because the new instructions say that you're supposed to report in reverse chronological order all positions that you've held. And let's say you're an individual who has had an academic career for, let's say, a decade on a 9-month appointment. You've had a variety of appointments in the summer, and now you're applying for your first NIH grant. Do you put those out of term appointments on your NIH Biosketch? I would never have thought of doing that. I don't consider them appointments relative to my academic home, my academic appointment. And I agree, Michelle, that I've got my benefits are annualized, but one thing my department chair points out is that even though I'm on a 9-month appointment, she doesn't lock me out of my lab in the summer. She thinks I'm in there full time doing research.
I think this is a really challenging issue for universities. across the board, never mind just in terms of funding. We do afford, institutions afford faculty access and really kind of with the expectation that they're going to find funding to support themselves in the summer in many cases, but it's not guaranteed. And it doesn't preclude faculty from being able to self-fund their research. If they're social scientists, many social scientists self-fund their own research. They still take credit for the publications, but they haven't had an investment necessarily from the university to actually do the work. And there's a benefit component to it. And that's the best case. I think contingent faculty becomes even more murky because we have, certainly at my institution, there are many contingent faculty who hold appointments at multiple institutions and utilize those multiple institutions in different ways for grant participation. And I just think it becomes very challenging for our institution to figure out what part of that do we own. You know, we could say we own all of it, but we certainly don't pay for all of it.
And
Have we got our responses?
as a 9-month faculty person, I'm still supervising graduate students in the summer, and they may be paying tuition for research hours in the summer, even though I'm not drawing a salary.
Okay.
What are the
Lily, do
results?
we have the results from our poll? There.
So let's see, 31% said not an issue for us, 39% said somewhat of an issue, 23% said significant issue, 5% said critical issue, and 1% said our most important issue. I certainly think that our federal sponsors would agree that it's an issue because they hadn't really even contemplated how that might confuse the way in which you provide information to them about your outside activities, particularly if they're international in nature. So maybe we move on to the next topic, which is variance and disclosure across different funding agencies. And what I want to say about this particular topic to get us started is simply what I think is from a faculty standpoint, and particularly for faculty who are drawing from more than one federal source of funding for their research. And I think there are many faculty who do actually draw funding from multiple federal agencies. You can just listen to the conversation yesterday to understand that NSF, NIH, DoD, and I'm sure if we kept going to other agencies that weren't represented, have variations in the way in which they are approaching the need to disclose information about international activities and outside engagements. And of course, we already know that they're asking for various types of documentation around the facilities that they have, the support that they receive for their research, the format of their CVs and so forth. And although the FDP, I think, has done really excellent work in trying to systematize the collection of information and the use of the standardized format for a CV, it's still for faculty navigating across the different requirements that different agencies have and understanding that they have to kind of take a snapshot of what they're doing and slice and dice it in different ways across those different agencies, I think is a challenge both in terms of the time involved, and it's also a challenge in terms of the judgment that they make about what things should be included where for which agency. Another component of that I think is very challenging for faculty is that, especially if you're, let's say, submitting to NSF and to NIH on a similar project, but in a different time period, you know, what might have been true in that one snapshot might not be true 6 months later. And so you can very quickly find yourself with data about your engagements that are not in sync with each other. And I think that challenge of keeping all of that current and simultaneously trying to do that in the format that each different agency is asking is a real challenge. As well, it is a challenge for faculty in particular to navigate where some of the reporting needs to happen at their home institution, in both the compilation of their grants and just the normal course of their everyday activities. So at any given institution, there's usually processes for merit, there's processes for disclosing consulting arrangements, there are processes for conflict of interest disclosures, for FCOI, and so forth. And those are often not all handled in the same systems, in the same timeline, or by the same office. And from an, I'll be very interested in the administrative perspective on this, but at least at our institution, the systems by which all of that is captured don't necessarily speak to each other. And so from a faculty perspective, it's just this massive push of information out to these various requests, and often just in time. So looking at the nuance of what's required is sometimes daunting. And so I think a lot of faculty, I would count myself in this because I still do apply for grants and have a lot of funding. You do the best job you can in the moment to try to get it right. You hope you don't contradict yourself, and you try to meet the deadlines so that your work can be considered. And I think all of that is very challenging. It's this particular conversation that led to something that Pamela referred to at the beginning, and I saw there were quite a few comments about this whole idea of a clearinghouse, which is to say that if there was a way for PIs to have the ability to simply deposit all of the different components of information that various agencies would want, including contracts and some of the backup documentation that your home institution might not want, but you would need to provide to an external agency, perhaps that's something that would be reducing the burden of all of this disclosure. And then our simple thought about this was to give rights to different users, including institutions, for the parts that they would want to have. But it would sort of move the locus of responsibility to keep that information up to date with the faculty, and also give them control over who sees what. It's just a thought, and it's not a fully baked thought yet, but it's something that is simply in conversation. We have a poll on this question too. So Lillian, could you share the poll on variance and disclosure requirements? So again, as with the other polls, we'd like to know if you think this is not an issue, somewhat of an issue, a significant issue, a critical issue, or our most important issue. And I don't know if other people have thoughts or if we want to talk about comments.
So I have comments. 2 points. One is, I think by having different standards for the different agencies, then it sets faculty want to do the lowest things. So let's say they're only submitting to NSF, then why should they have to reach the goal of NIH? And so you start getting agitation among faculty because you're going to probably, as an institution, do equals. You're going to do to the highest bar and set it for everybody. Or then you're going to get confused yourself with the varying ways for the agencies. So that it becomes really confusing. And the second thing is what you pointed out, Michelle, is that there are multiple offices for these things. And so when you do ask for declaration of foreign conflict of interest, faculty can get upset because they already submitted something to outside work for pay, and now they have to resubmit it to this list. And so it's an extra burden because it's these inefficiencies. And in both cases, then faculty feel burdened by these standards that have to be imposed internally by the university to meet the needs of these rules.
That's a really good point.
I know we only have about 5 more minutes for the faculty panel aspect, so maybe we'll cover the poll and then quickly touch on that important last topic as well.
So So I think on this particular poll, 94% say it's somewhat of an issue, a significant issue, or critical issue, or our most important issue. 6% say it's not an issue. 4% say it's not an issue. 17% say somewhat of an issue. 38% a significant issue. 33% a critical issue, and 8% are most important issues. So I see this resonates with our audience. Thank you for your feedback.
And consistent with the thought exchange of harmonization being a key element of what we're trying to do. So Alice, could you just maybe spend a few minutes talking about the issue of perceived persecution of our international colleagues?
Yeah, and I think that one real concern that I'm hearing from colleagues is that they're concerned that individuals who hail from Asia are maybe either being targeted or feeling that they're being targeted. And I gave you the example of a recent colleague who's very concerned that he shouldn't engage in an appropriate collaboration, or that he's going to be asked questions that I am not going to be asked. And I'm also concerned that some faculty are hearing that they shouldn't be collaborating, or that they should be thinking twice about working with scientific colleagues in certain countries. And I think that is going to harm science in the long run, harm research in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Important perspective. So, well, thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts on this. And you'll have more opportunity because we have Q&A at the end, and we've had a number of questions come in. But maybe we could switch for now and get the administrative perspective. And Doug Backman is here to talk with us about that. Moses, if we could go back to the slide deck. Thank you. Doug?
Thank you, Pamela. Appreciate it. Today, I wanted to talk about how the University of Central Florida has been managing and really running into many problems, most of which is what you've been hearing about, but from an administrative point of view, as it deals with foreign influence. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about our conflict of interest system to lead into some other issues that have been, from my perspective, insurmountable. So we do have an online self-created COI disclosure system, and we have 12 questions, and all faculty are required to disclose online to these questions. Employees that are responsible for the design, conduct, and reporting of the research must disclose. And there's a workflow process that includes management plans, hierarchy, people approving the conflict of interest disclosures. There's also an opportunity for updates, annual updates, and intermittent updates if they need to be done. There is some system communication between the pre and post-award and departmental units, although there's still some gaps and weaknesses in our system. But so with the federal reporting requirements, what has happened is that's a challenge. And you've just witnessed many of the things that are out there that we're all dealing with. And as Jim has talked about, I also don't have answers how to help faculty into responding to some of these issues and what to report. But on top of it, in July of 2020, the Florida legislature added another layer to all of the SUS systems in Florida. And while this may be particular to Florida, all I can say is I hope it does not happen to your institutions. But what it now requires is, instead of the engagement in the design, conduct, and reporting where you're accountable for the state of Florida, it's whether you're engaged, and meaning whether you're being assigned. So you can imagine undergraduates, graduates, anybody who's assigned to these projects now have to disclose. And that's increased our disclosure by about 1,500 people, to be honest with you. Also, we're supposed to affirm the receipt of a determination that the outside activity does not affect the integrity of the state university. Number three, the financial interest includes anything of value. And right now, as you know, from a federal point of view, it's $5,000 and up. And on top of all of this, failure to disclose will result in suspension without pay, pending an investigation, which can take no longer than 60 days, and possible termination. Now, you can imagine how difficult it is to review these conflicts of interest disclosures. And my office, for example, will be reviewing some of these, for 6 months, 8 months, 9 months period of time, just working with faculty to carve everything out. To up that to 60-day period with knowing that there could be a potential suspension or termination is really a difficult thing. So we were called to Tallahassee, to the state capitol, to talk about certain requirements that we were looking at. And those include what I call the red flag indicators and required assessments. Because what they wanted to know, when I say they, I mean the legislature, what they wanted to know was what we had identified and what we were doing with these red flags. And so we had to give them an analysis of what we were doing and how we were doing it, and with reports. And so I just wanted to go through a little bit with the time I have to talk about some of this and how it affected us. So we obviously look at our outside activity disclosures. That includes the international outside. And may I point out that it's not just People's Republic of China, it's all international activity we have to review. It makes it very difficult. Faculty go in the summer, not just to one place like China, they may go to 4 or 5 different countries during that 3-month period, doing basically the similar thing. So in addition to that, we have to evaluate publications, exactly what was being brought out today. We have to look at travel. We have to approve travel. We have to review the visiting scholars and people who are being invited. And we have to ask ourselves, are these folks coming from a denied entity point of view, a high-risk entity affiliation? We have to look at the international website disclosure affiliations to find out what, how, why, or where. I really do feel in some cases like an FBI agent. I mean, I have to look at all these things to come to a conclusion. And it's difficult. And if some of these red flags are, I guess I'll use the term positive, we have ended up having interviews, and I'll call them investigations for these faculty. And, we're taking a look at the background research, obviously, as to what they're doing. We have to document these red flags. We have to follow up with interview questions. And I can tell you these interview questions, which is an accumulation of what we've done based on the red flags, based on their COI disclosures, is really one-on-one in a Zoom interview, me and a colleague, and going through some of these questions. It's really daunting. And for them to now be aware that they're being asked these questions to verify what, how, why, and where is becoming just a very interesting process. So there's the normal follow-up and the disclosure process that we come up with these. And I will tell you, we've probably been through a total of about 15 faculty that we've inquired more based on these red flags. And it has, of that, and we have about 3,000 faculty. I would say more than about 1,000 of them are doing research at our institution. And we have ended up with one who has disclosed to us about being in a talent program. And we have more that we're taking a look at, but it's a lot of work to uncover one faculty member. So all of the connect the dots are out there with these types of issues. I think it's been more pronounced when it comes to the state legislature, but I have a staff for the COI portion of what we do of 3 people. And this has been overwhelming, to be honest with you. So I just wanted to also, if you could go to the next slide real quickly, this is what we ended up. We added a question 12 to our conflict of interest questionnaire. And this is the best we could come up with as to what to ask and why. There's a number of cascade questions. I don't have time to go into them, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what we're asking and why. And yes, the faculty are becoming more aware. I got a email during this session about whether they can affiliate with the Chinese institution. If it's okay or not, please get back with them. So it's the awareness is there. I'm glad to see that. But again, I just wanted to let you know about the burden that is on administrators and how I understand some of the faculty questions that are coming up and why. And I guess I'll just leave it open to questions at this point.
Doug, if I can start with a question for you. You're director of compliance, right,
Right.
for your institution.
Right.
And so I'm betting you know quite a bit about risk assessment. So if you were to run the amount of effort and the amount of results that you're having in what you're doing, what you're needing to do right now, relative to this, how would it score? You know, if you didn't have, if you were just doing it on a straight risk assessment basis, how would it guide your outcomes?
I would say it's less than 5%.
Okay. Is the cost, I mean, from your perspective, you know, again, if we were looking at it just sheerly on a numeric kind of calculation, does it warrant this degree of scrutiny?
I think in the end it will not.
Okay.
And I have to add that we're not just the conflict of interest group, but also I have an export control staff that are heavily involved in this. And there's another level of compliance, and 2 and 3 of their staff members have been involved with biweekly meetings. It's very intense and somewhat overwhelming from an administrative point of view.
Okay, so I think we're ready then, unless Jim, did you have a question or any of our other panelists for Doug?
I was just going to say, Doug, really interesting. I was Googling Florida and some of this, and, you know, I guess Moffett was one of the early issues that was public, right? And I forget whether the state of Florida has had other issues, but boy, pretty aggressive. Keep it in Florida, please.
Yeah,
that's all I can say.
What I would comment on is that the Moffett, unfortunately, is what started everything. And I could go into the details, but it went from a senator, then to the legislature, and then being, in essence, accosted to go up to the Capitol and give a discussion and talk. And then what I've explained is the result of it. So I hope I do keep it in Florida.
Okay. Thanks for that. We do have quite a few questions. So I think if we want to stop the slides, we can just go into having everybody on screen and we can go into some of those. One very interesting question I thought that came in is a question for the faculty panelists about, and we can then do the administrators too, about how concerned they are about the fact that they may have signed agreements with foreign entities or appointment arrangements that required them to keep those arrangements confidential, whether that's a talent program or simply some other kind of arrangement, and are now potentially then caught between a rock and a hard place of who, you know, whose rules do I not comply with? Is that a concern, or have you heard of that being a concern?
I'm not sure I would say it was a concern. I think it's a reality.
Okay.
But I also don't think it's only with foreign entities that individuals may have signed a non-disclosure agreement. At some point, I learned that I think it's the University of California system recommends that faculty who are going to engage in consulting have university council take a look at proposed consulting agreements, because those agreements may have language in them that talk about intellectual property in ways that I, as a fact, with my training, don't understand. And that council would be able to translate a consulting agreement to indicate, what are you agreeing to? So I think it's a reality that faculty have signed agreements like that. But again, I don't think it's only with foreign entities.
Anyone else care to comment?
I think, from a UCS perspective, General Counsel does not want us to review these other agreements, these agreements that don't affect us. And I'm not sure how I'm going to reconcile that. They asked for help, and it's something that may need to be required to be put into the proposal, as you all know. So it's, like Jim has made a couple of comments. How am I supposed to fathom this? How am I supposed to manage the outcome? And I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah.
I think that's the bit, at least in my impression, the biggest single issue, because you either open the gates and review every agreement and assume liability, hire the resources, go through the whole process and everything else, or you train the faculty, try to have processes, and rely on the faculty signing the certification saying everything's accurate, right? I mean, it's kind of a one or the other, which is generally not how we do things, right? We try to figure out relationships, systems, internal controls, tools where we can enable the faculty from an administrative and compliance standpoint to be successful. And here, it's like one or the other. So it's
and
a
as
big
I'm
one.
thinking about it, it may have been that I remember reading that there was some university system that recommended that faculty put into any agreement they signed something about their primary employer, in my case, it's Texas Tech's expectations with respect to intellectual property, that I should be putting that as a term into any condition, any contract I sign.
Or even language that might be something like, in the event of any inconsistency between Texas Tech's rules and this agreement, Texas Tech prevails. So.
I don't think my counsel is on the call, but
Yeah.
but that's not how we train. That's not how I mean, I'm not sure about Laura and Michelle, but that's new to me to think that way.
Yeah, I was going to say that too. I think if you let faculty know what they need to do, that's a big start. And how do you do that and keep it on the forefront? Because you could tell me now, but in 3 years, I'm in something and I might forget. And so how do you keep it so that I'm thinking about it? And certainly all of this in this session kind of brings it to the forefront in all faculty minds, I think, what's going on. And so I'm sure no one's forgetting about it right now. And so that's a good thing, I think.
But Laura, my only concern about that is this takes a village, right? I mean, that graphic of the 15 different dots shows that, we can't, even if I could figure out exactly how to describe research and exactly define Biosketch and exactly, and like all those things, still, that's a big ask for faculty who need to be in the lab doing research, right? That's my concern.
And it may
I'm
not
sorry,
be
Michelle.
just faculty. It may also be, we have a lot of people who are probably in professional staff or research scientist roles who probably are more likely to have consulting arrangements. You've got to communicate with them.
We have a very centralized system for reviewing contracts and NDAs and MOUs. We really strongly discourage faculty from signing off on an MOU, for instance, or certainly they're not allowed to represent the university, but even one of their own making. And similarly, when you enter into an NDA as a faculty on behalf of the university, that's not really something you can do at our institution, although I don't know that faculty always understand that. But because we have a fairly centralized system, we've tried to build a culture of consultation. And I really appreciate what Doug, was saying earlier. We don't necessarily want to know about every arrangement that you have that doesn't, connect to your Temple University employment structure. On the other hand, we don't want you making bad decisions either about what to enter into. So we do have a fairly open door policy to just give some guidance on how to think about things. But I think that issue is a really sticky issue, as Jim pointed out, for faculty.
So Doug, one of the questions that has come in on the Q&A is about training and helping faculty learn their obligations relative to the foreign disclosure training. I know you talked about the interviews that you've had to do with faculty where you've gotten certain responses on those questions, but is there also a training program relative to helping people understand what this is all about and what they need to disclose?
There is, but it's online, meaning that you can go to our disclosure database system, and there's a very graphic how to answer these questions. What do these questions mean? When you go into any topic, it may be highlighted, and you can glean from that. And I also say that I didn't show it, I was going to, but because of time, there's a matrix that we have that outlines what do you have to what is the question, what to disclose, what not to disclose. And you can go to that on our website to see it. And it's very helpful to faculty, but I would agree with you, and we don't do this. So the answer is no. We have not gone and done individual conflict of interest information systems to faculty, although with all that's going on, and I'm not even telling you about the new session of that's going on with Florida, it's time that we do that.
Thank you. I'm noting in the Q&A a comment that I think is worthy of being shared from a faculty member. And I'll just read part of it, but it basically says, in the wider view, there's no American science and foreign science. There's just science. And in the name of ownership, we can destroy academic freedom and destroy great universities and the ability to do basic science if we don't go about this properly. So
I really agree with that. And I would also say in all the interviews we've done and the investigations, all that we've had to do, faculty want to do the right thing. They just need to know what to do. That's really what it boils down to. I'm not saying there's bad apples in any group, but at the end of the day, majority of these people just want to know what to do and how to do it.
There's also a comment in here that it would be helpful if FDP could create a determination tool to provide some guidance as to what type of activities should be disclosed. And I think, there are a number of, both FDP and COGR, for example, are having conversations along those lines about, what might be possible that could become at least somewhat of a national standard if we can achieve this harmonization, whether that comes from the agencies, whether it comes from a grassroots type of effort. But there is value in having commonality of approach. And as my audit people say, safety in numbers, when our practices are similar across our peers, and our approaches are similar across, so that can be a value. But I think part of what all the harmonization efforts too is all about at this point is trying to get to the point where something like that could be created, and it would be realistic to create it. I have then finally a recommendation I'm going to share before I turn it back to Jim to close for us, is that we have a recommendation from someone that said it would be very helpful for the next FDP meeting, if there could be a faculty agency panel where the faculty ask these questions directly to the agencies. And you can hear specifically how the agencies would address them. So that is something definitely we will take under consideration. So Jim, do you want to bring us home?
Yeah, thanks. Well, first I wanted to thank all the panelists. This is something we've talked about from, I think Pamela and I talked a couple of months ago, or came up in the Fluent Influence Working Group about how critical the faculty perspective is. It just resonates in a way with the feds in a way that compliance and admin professionals, it's critical that we're involved, obviously, but the faculty have a way of conveying it and personalizing, which is so critical. So we appreciate that. Wanted to thank Moses, Lillian, and David. As always, Lillian pulls a rabbit out of the hat at every one of these sessions as we add polls and other things at the very last minute. So thank you, Lily. As far as next steps, real briefly, and Pamela, jump in. We'll take a look at all these, all the questions, the Q&As, the questions that came through. We'll likely combine them with yesterday's federal panel. We'll consolidate them, and we will get them to the federal partners for input. We will certainly share this video with them. I think this had a different twist than yesterday, again, from a faculty perspective. So we'll ask our federal friends if they have time to watch this. And, you know, Pamela, but everyone, you know, we have done several improper influence sessions outside of the normal FDP cycle. I do wonder if this is a topic due to the timeliness of it. Maybe after NSF comes out with their stuff, after NIH continues to clarify with their FAQs, that 6 weeks from now, 2 months from now, it might be timely to have these discussions again. Mm-hmm. But thanks to everyone, and have hopefully a great long weekend. Thank you.